Dear colleagues, good afternoon. My name is Dmitri Teperik, and I am an executive director of International Center for Defense and Security in Tallinn, Estonia. Thank you very much for coming to our presentation of the results of the study which we conducted in Ukraine in October last year. About our center, we are a leading center in the defense and security matters in Europe. We are affiliated with the Ministry of Defense of Estonia. However, our studies are independent studies and we provide analytical data. We conduct analysis in the sphere of security, also connected with NATO allies. And one of the topics of our research with colleagues from our organizations was voluntary movement in Ukraine. The following authors took part in this research, and here you can see people who were also participated, but there were also other people who helped us to collect data in Ukraine, and why Estonia, why Ukraine, and why volunteers? We think that our approach is an integrated approach to the defense, which was developed in Estonia for recent 25 years. It can serve as a model for Ukraine, which Ukraine can follow or learn on our lessons and conceptual practical experience which Ukraine gained due to the hostilities. These lessons also could be used in Estonia. There is a militarized, a paramilitary organization, Kiili. This is a Union of Defense of Estonia. It also can be used as a best practice example, and as we usually say, we have such a competition between friends, between the Baltic countries, and the Estonia experience is more relevant with respect to Ukraine because we have not only conscripts. Talking about the hybrid approach to the national defense and security, Estonia is a country combining all approaches. We have professional forces, we have conscripts, and we have the Union of Defense, an NGO, which is an unalienable component of security system. In Estonia, the situation is quite the other way in Lithuania and Latvia. As concerned hybrid war and defense against the aggression of the Russian Federation in Ukraine, that is why we focused our attention on Ukraine, and international channels of support to your country opened in Estonia, and we are your allies, your friends, and we decided to support you by our experience and our recommendations, because I think when some country is involved in hostilities, it doesn't have enough time and forces and resources to make in deep studies into military volunteers topic. So we offer the view from inside in Estonia. Why volunteers? You know that they were the first who were enough resolute to defend the country against the aggression because of their motivations. This is a unique experience unique case in the novel history, the phenomenon of civil movement of militarized volunteers. So it is worth further analysis of this topic. And also Russian aggressive propaganda made the volunteers the target for 2 years, using new methods of attacking and learning the mechanism of Russian propaganda. It always is well thought in the selection of its target, and so that militarized volunteers have been the target of Russian propaganda for 2 years. This gives us the reason to think that these militarized volunteers are real force. Otherwise, Russians will not take them in focus. So young men and even women, they went to the front line and became a military man, volunteer in military men, and assessment of their potential in the new system of the national security and information and psychological support, which influence on their spirit and moral. The main focus of research, there were main focuses during our last trip. Colleagues and me visited many military units and voluntary battalions in Ukraine, both in the rear and near the front line. And now I would like to give the floor to my colleague Anne. She will tell more in detail about the conclusions of our study. I will be talking in Ukrainian. So we did that to develop a profile of military volunteer. We met soldiers on site. We visited the range of sites, and thanks to Battalion Donbass, Dnipro 1, TSU, and armed forces, and other volunteers who we have managed to find, according to our outcomes, 91% are male, and only 8.7% of female go to the military volunteers movement. The geography is homogeneous by regions. As concerned language, it is 50-50. They are both Ukrainian and Russian speaking persons, and there are also persons, bilingual persons among them. This people, they have families and children. This is a motivational factors. They go to defend their families. This is the main factor why they enter battalions, military battalions. You can see that they are mostly under 20 years old, and 80% of volunteers are under 40 years, and most of them have a higher educational background but no experience in hostilities or combat actions. This is an important thing to understand, because their motivation quite otherwise, and those who studied in some military institutes, as concerned the experience of combats of hostilities, more than 80% of volunteers do not have any. And after they enter voluntary unit, they gain such experience. More than 57% gain such experience of participants in hostilities. Very many young men who has families, children, they go to the war without any experience of participation in hostilities, so they are motivated only by the decision to defend. So methodology of research, personal motivation, this was quite important in our research. Yes, our research, I used the methodology of Mr. Schwartz, Professor Schwartz. This was internal values. They underlie our motivations, and the values, the system of values of every person differs, and one or two values are the main ones. They are the key, the core, and all other values prioritizations depend on this first top two. The prioritization of values among volunteers in Ukraine. The first value is families, safety, the second is national security. I have conducted the study among volunteers in Estonia. The family safety is always on the first place. It is always on the top. It is the main thing for everyone in military organization, and the second point in military organization and the assessment is the national security, because in the group for control, which group of people who are not in military organizations, for them national security was on 18th place.
What conclusion can we make from this slide? To protect the national safety, first of all, you need to take care of your family, of your close ones. And here, the big role is played by the Institute of Family. Regarding the traditions, the tradition was exactly what distinguished Ukraine from other countries. And here we should think what traditions in Ukraine can play against the country development. For example, the traditional roles of men and women. As in many countries, for example, all the positions in the army are equally open for men and women. And that's why it's very useful. Here is what we need to consider in the management of such organizations. The leader should know about these values. And leaders should be loyal and trustful, as the trust can be lost very, very easy, but it's very difficult to gain it back. And also, we need to think that volunteers are very effective, but they can't be used as a whale without bottom, because these people, they have names, they have house, they have their own full-time job. They are not a kind of whale. As we see, national security is a priority for Ukrainians, and it's clear why. Because we are in the time of crisis, in the time of war. And what is important and very interesting here, when we asked what is the guarantee of security of Ukraine for you, 80% says this is development of independent, powerful Ukraine. Nobody is waiting for some help, and it means that all these people who came to be volunteers, they can see their contribution they're doing, and with their motivation they are ready to build up the security and to be the integral part of it in the future. What is interesting here, when we asked for the three main reasons why you decided to join the volunteer military formation, here the most important is that this question is about 2014. It reflects the condition of armed forces in 2014. And it's clear that 59% told that they don't trust the regular army of Ukraine. They can see better conditions in the military service in volunteer battalions, where they can see better discipline and historical glory of one division or another. It's not such a critics for government, but there are just positions to work on. And now, after talking to all the volunteers, branding and image of the army changed, and it changed thanks to the volunteers as well. Because you can see from this slide that they even saw their professional development in the regular armed forces of Ukraine. For the moment, they estimate more or less positively their evaluation of the service, its capabilities to develop them and to use these useful skills in the division or battalion they're in now. But 50% told no, so there is a room for improvement. Evaluation of the conditions of the services. This slide is complicated. There are a lot of issues here, but yellow is positive trend. Dark side is negative trend. And the evaluation of service conditions in general, the organization of food in the battalions, general psychological climate are in positive trend, but activities of military psychologists is negative trend. It is a problem. We need to work on it. Then the activities of the military management, it's a huge negative trend, but it is crossed with the issues of the commanders on the low level. The guys trust more their low commanders than their management. Why did we make this research? Because now volunteer movement is on the stage of complete integration into regular armed forces. But we distinguish them on motivational structure because these people position themselves as volunteers. But do they have perspectives? Do they see perspectives in their service in regular armed forces? Let's imagine a situation. War is finished. What options does Ukrainian volunteer movement has? Will they go to regular structures? Is integration of volunteer military formation influence to your personal. 40% says no and 40% says yes. We can see that clear distribution. Who feels that they don't care, and these are 22%, and these people will be in volunteer formations and they don't care who influences them and what's going on, because they can see themselves and the commandment. But some of them are worried about it. And what is the consequence of the integration and the consequences of such integration for yourself? This is a question about their future, how they see themselves. Most of them say that they will be service until the end of ATO, and only after that they will go home. If to compare it with 22% who say I will take the final decision after in some time. So these people who want to stay in ATO till the end, these are people with who we can work even now, to work with them, to let them stay. Oh, this is the potential for the future, potential volunteer movement, like it is in Estonia. And some of them can see already the development in the regular armed forces. And this slide, the question is on which conditions you would agree to become professional military in the regular armed forces of Ukraine, National Guard, etc. And here there are three main points. 56% is qualified and clever management. Second is adequate formation of all necessary for military service, because militaries want to feel they are invested, and that the management is using money for useful and effective means. There are a lot of drivers influence to the motivation of the militaries. There are drivers for integration, drivers to be volunteer, and drivers to their psychological movements, to their psychological moods. And it's very interesting because now we are in the state of hybrid war, and hybrid war means there is information. And this information is an important factor. It influences to the motivation of the fighter, its propaganda, its media. That's why I give the floor to our expert on these issues. Yes, that's true. Volunteer battalions are those that are the strongest propaganda tool, and we were trying to detect the channels through which they might be influenced. And on this schedule you can see two interesting results. That most of all, few times a day, volunteers are using social networks and online newspapers. But at the same time, the trust to them is rather high. Also, they trust their relatives and their immediate management. Trust to them is much more higher, and as we understand, there is intensive communication with the family goes on, and the level of trust to them is rather high. Yes, thank you. On this slide, we were asking from what channel you can feel the pressure on you. And here's the main classic media are those transferring the information. But at the same time, still there is a trend to trust the relatives, the possibility of aggressive influence through the channel of commandment or relatives. The risk is low, risk of influence. One of the hypotheses we had, the volunteers themselves don't have enough information about the events. And as we found out, that's their personal subjective opinion. They think the scope of information they get is sufficient for themselves. On these two schedules, you can see two interesting nuances. On the top schedule, there is information psychological attacks that, according to the evaluation of the fighter himself, influence to the combat spirit and moral. And when person talks about himself, is a bit subjective, and he thinks he's not so much influential. His spirit and his moral are not under influence. But as we look at the opinion of the volunteers, what they think about the population of Ukraine, here's the vision of the volunteer is completely different. Volunteer is more sure in himself and his comrades than in the population. And on the schedule below, we can see the support. From which channel the fighter feels the support. And the trend is confirmed that the trust to official power to government is low, but the trust to the relatives and close ones is rather high. But the schedule is also important. That volunteers here pointed out independent activists and NGOs as one of the sources of information psychological support. We don't mean the fact of availability of support. We mean how the fighter feels it. That is a table with the attitude of volunteers themselves to ATO, to regular forces of Ukraine, and how does he evaluate the coverage of media on these structures? And does he think it's objective? And does he think it's sufficient? Here it's important to note, volunteers think the information about ATO, regular armed forces, volunteer battalions, and separatist and Russian mercenaries is not enough. And it's not objective. Regarding the interesting results, it was very interesting for us to understand, are volunteers able to see the existence of information psychological attack? The volunteers themselves think that they can't see information psychological attacks as this on themselves. And asking the general question, would it be peace on the east of Ukraine if there are no information psychological influence? Most of the volunteers think peace could be conserved without intensive information psychological attacks and event support. And this is a question, also general question, and it is asked every time by the management what to do and how to find the channels distributing information. And here we are talking about is there is a need to block the sources of information, because this topic is rather sensitive, to keep this source, to control it, or just to block it completely. How it will influence to the people? Will they keep looking for the sources of information? Where they will look for them? And answering this question, volunteers told us it would be nice to block sources of information at all. I would like to add that regarding this research and why it's so important now, here we could see psychological type and the profile of the military now in Ukraine in crisis times, and this motivation is very strong at the moment, that's clear. But this image of the volunteer influence to the counter-attack of the aggressor, and it's already the driver of this war. That's important because this war goes not just with the help of tanks, but also in the information environment. That's why we could see how does volunteer movement influence to that, and how many people more will go to this movement if it will be disqualified. Or service in army, will it be disqualified or not? That's why this component depends a lot from where they take information, how these events are covered, and how the government is working with motivational structure, with information structure, and these components. How they help people to get motivated to go to defend their country. It's clear it's a crisis times now, but what's going to happen next? As we see, such structure of volunteer formation as in Estonia is official component of the armed forces of Estonia. And there is legislation for it. And for Ukraine, this prototype can serve as an example for the future, but we won't just copy it completely. Maybe it will be some hybrid option of such structure, but why is it important to understand today?
Because these military volunteers in Ukraine, they have already gained a unique experience for 2 years, and they have formed potential for this movement, but it should have some platform to exercise their to implement their resources, to realize and to make contribution to the defense of Ukraine in future, because the component of integral security and defense is not only military structures, but also volunteers and civil society. All sectors are involved in this design, and we see this phenomenon in Ukraine today. So Ukraine should create its hybrid system of integrated comprehensive system of defense and security, including voluntary sector. So activists should be a component in line with the military units. This personal motivation of military volunteers in Ukraine, this is a guarantee that the policy of potential volunteering organizations will be right and will be correctly integrated into the general system of security and defense of Ukraine. They have one standard of training, but volunteers, they are people who go to work every day, but they will be ready to conscription within 24 hours and to defend their motherland. In the time of crisis, they will receive the same, will be paid salaries and defend Ukraine for the same salaries. So those persons who receive salaries in the military service, they are military men. No, they are not mandatorily regular forces. They could be volunteers. So despite continuous hostile propaganda, they maintain a stable spirit which requires more support from government and headquarters of the defense system. Maybe not a structured level message. They have their own messages. They are so patriotic. And there is a request, there is demand in society, but these volunteering organizations, these volunteers, they should be structured. The spirit is very important when it is used in the right direction, so that people understand that there is such platform where then they can realize themselves not in regular army, but like volunteers, military volunteers. Thank you. Thank you very much. We have some time for a series of questions and comments from our audience. Are there any questions? You are welcome. Introduce yourself, please. Alexander Kiriyenko, Institute of History of the Academy of Sciences of Ukraine. And I have a question. How do you plan the results of your research to implement? Who this research is addressed to from governmental army structures? Maybe you have addressees already who you will distribute, mail the findings of your research. Thank you very much for your question. I will give you some details because yesterday in the Embassy of Estonia there was a conference organized by the Ministry of Defense of Estonia and Kiili NGO, and there were representatives from the leadership of the Ukrainian Armed Forces and the Ministry of Internal Affairs and the Ministry of Defense and the Security Service of Ukraine and other bodies such as military reconnaissance. So all military and paramilitary bodies who may be interested in the findings of this research, they have already received this information, and this is only the initial results of our research. Our center will issue, of course, a report giving more details. They will be disseminated to the agencies which I have listed already. And we cooperated with many organizations. We have developed a profile of Ukrainian military volunteer, and his potential was assessed, how this volunteer can be used, his potential can be used in future. Mikhail Savostin. My question is who you will see as a driver and implementer of your ideas. Ukraine should rely on someone, maybe some political forces in parliament. You see that they will support you, maybe some think tanks, analytical centers, but if you just have contacts with the Ministry of Defense, it might appear not very efficient. You answered your question yourself. Our approach includes participatory approach. We will have contacts with civil society sector connected to the defense area, talking about volunteers from the third sector. They can become the leading force to form the defense in Ukraine. This is just the experience of Estonia. When the third sector enters some area and the government supports it, such movements, such organization should be not partisan, not political. Kiili is non-partisan organization, and this is clearly stated in its articles. Political forces should make promotion of this non-partisan idea, so you can see that Kiili works with any formations, and in Ukraine we can see that many partners already are willing to understand how Kiili operates in Estonia, and we have good prospects even at the official level already. We have time left for one or two questions, colleagues. Well, we have no questions. Thank you, dear friends, for your presentation, and good luck.